Okay. Nope. Right. Move this up a little bit. Testing. Okay. All right. So just in case everyone hadn't had enough of animations between Karen's talk earlier this year and Jenny's talk last week, and now Chel's talk, I thought I'd talk about some practical applications and how animations apply to Angular. Oh, yeah, sorry. That's my bad. Right. So the intent of this talk is not really for you guys to be masters of ngAnimate by the end of it. It's kind of a big library. It's complex. A lot of things that can play into it. It's really just for you guys to be able to have some confidence, look into it yourselves, maybe start doing some animations in your own Angular apps. So what is ngAnimate? Well, it's an Angular module, just like UI Router. And it's a module that allows you to relatively easily harness the power of CSS and JavaScript-based animations. So with CSS animations, it handles a lot of the bookkeeping for you in terms of hooking onto events related to the DOM. More on that later. And with JavaScript, we can use it to abstract away or kind of can JS-based animations using libraries like jQuery. It also supports advanced JavaScript animation libraries like GSAP or Bounce.js. So also, yeah, ngAnimate is fun. So I wanted to talk a little bit before I dive into what Angular Animate does for you, what CSS animations, just vanilla CSS animations were like. And I won't spend too much time on this because I think Chel kind of covered it pretty well. But basically, yeah, you define like a pseudo selector and the base state, and then you have a transition where you mark out properties you define and a time that you want those to occur in. You can also, I'll get to that later actually. So what about what JS handling animations in vanilla JavaScript was like before things like Angular Animate? So some event happens in the browser, and hold on. So some event happens in the browser, a class is applied or changed on some DOM element, and a transition or keyframe is triggered from that. So what's the problem with that? Well, of course, so there's some problems that occur, like so with libraries like jQuery, of course, we can inject elements into the DOM, but there's really no good way to animate the way that they come in or leave because the DOM is re-rendered with methods like append in jQuery. Also, what if we want to do something after an animation is finished? This turns out to be kind of tricky. You can listen for an event called transition end, but whether that event fires or when it fires isn't always super reliable. Also, how do we reliably deal with like pausing or resuming or changing animations? So these are kind of non-trivial problems. They're sort of hard to figure out, but luckily for us, the good people at Angular have sort of figured it out for us. What about vanilla Angular? So like the best approach before Angular Animate was to control the adding and removal of classes using ngClass. But it's kind of code heavy, it's sort of messy. It's unreliable in terms of like catching events. And it's difficult to hook into like existing Angular directives like ngRepeat, things like that. So what ngAnimate gives you is it allows you to tap into transitions and keyframes. You can easily enable and disable animations. You can set up things to run after other things, and you can create animation modules for your app. So this is cool because basically, like I said, all the bookkeeping and difficult listing for events is handled for you, and it's also very performance optimized. So let me move on. All right, so how can you get started with ngAnimate? So it's easy. You can just npm install it, script in Angular. It's important to script in Angular animate after Angular and before whatever app you're running, because you're going to inject it down here as an Angular module. So there's a couple different ways, like I mentioned before, that you can animate things with ngAnimate. One is by just using regular CSS animations, which really everything is using behind the scenes, I think, even jQuery. But you can also create these app.animate modules using JavaScript, which you can then use. So this is kind of the basic approach. You add some class to an element. You create a corresponding CSS rule, utilizing these Angular keywords as pseudo-selectors. So you can hook onto enter and leave events for adding things to the DOM. Add and remove plays into ngRepeat, and there's some others as well. So how does this work exactly? Luckily, I came with some demos. So here, basically, I'm setting up an ngIf, which will show or hide. Not show or hide, basically inject or remove this DOM element, which is just a div that says fading out based on a Boolean, which I can click and let me just. Here, click fade in, and it'll fade in, fade out, it'll go away. Cool. Go back to. All right. So I've got another demo, similar sort of concept. We initialize an array, then we have a model, ng model, which is taking an input, and down here we register enter and leave events with the CSS that will control those ngRepeated elements when they either enter or leave the DOM based on our search. So here, so I've got David, Nimit, Joe, John. I can just Joe and John. You can kind of see that they all fade up, fade out. Yeah. So Angular JavaScript animations using ngAnimate are very similar to the CSS animations. We attach a class to an element, and then after injecting and wiring up ngAnimate and everything, you just do an app.animate, pass in the animation name as a dot class. It's important. That's important. You're using the selector, so it needs to have that dot, and then just pass a function that returns an object with key value pairs, which are the same pseudo class selectors that we were hooking into before. So like on load or like active. So this is another example, basically doing a similar thing to what my last example was doing, only in JavaScript. So, you can see, actually maybe I've lost it. There we go. This is all jQuery based. Yeah. So I wanted to talk about some of the advanced features as well. So there's something called animation anchoring, and it's a way to communicate animations between different views or states within your app. So basically, animation in one state will affect or be translated to animation in another state. And I'm actually running out of time. Hang on. This is probably the coolest thing. So we create a reference between, sorry. So this is kind of how it works. We create a reference between two elements using this ngAnimate ref directive. And on a state change, ngAnimate checks to see if there's a match reference between existing or the exiting and entering states. ngAnimate then creates a clone of the first element and attempts to animate the position of the second element to the first in the next view. And I've got a kind of a cool example of that. And that's kind of where I'll end, I think. So yeah, this is from Angular site, kind of showing this. So there's two different states. You can kind of see this if I go back. Kind of cool. All right, and that's all I have time for. So thank you.